Hi, I'm Alex Gosse, owner of Magically Resin, and working in collaboration with Shop Resin Molds to bring you some new ideas to inspire you for how to use your molds, how to care for your molds, different ways that maybe you hadn't thought of to play with your molds. I absolutely love these beautiful, high quality, very thoughtfully designed molds. As a longtime resin artist, I really appreciate having good molds that I can go to that when I'm not quite sure what I want to make, the mold offers enough texture and idea that the mold speaks to me. And so many of Shop Resin molds have such good design that you sit down and you look at it. Look how beautiful this thing is. It just speaks that it wants color shift because it has waves. And so I love that about these molds, that so many of the designs offer, they're a work of art in themselves. So I decided that I would start off with a color shift blue mica. This changes to a purple and a gold, and it is very transparent. I use another color shift later that is very chrome and reflective. Not chrome in color, but chrome in that it's reflective. So I really enjoy dusting these molds with color shift here and there to really accentuate the beautiful curves of the mold. So I'm just going by feel. I want to make sure that all of the powder is really rubbed in very well to the silicone. By the time I get to where I'm pouring resin, I do not want there to be any loose powder anywhere in the mold because it will come up in the resin. And while this could be done two ways, I could be dusting this to be able to demold it to use the wavy side. I'm not going to do that today. What I'm doing today is I'm planning on this being a tray and I want it to be flat. So I'm dusting it to where I'm going to pour clear resin on it, and I want to be able to see through the clear resin into the tray and the color shift accentuated because of the curves and the shape. So I decided that it was probably a good time to go ahead and get my edging down. I want a gold edge on this piece, and what I'm using is an alcohol ink that I mixed myself that is isopropyl alcohol plus mica powder. But you could get a very similar effect by using Pinata Gold and using some alcohol to spread it out. So it would be a little bit different. I do this because it's more cost effective and I make resin pieces every day. But really, it's so fun to play with alcohol inks directly on the silicone. And I'm moving it around with a silicone tipped brush, I call it. It's really just a pointer that is silicone. I think they use them for doing nails and stuff like that. And I had one that broke, so the silicone came out of the edge, so I just stuck it on a sharp stick and carried on about what I was doing. So this can be done in a bunch of different ways, but I really do like using a silicone tipped tool when spreading around the alcohol ink, and I feel like that really gives a lot of opportunity to get the alcohol ink where you want it. It's also really important when doing this that you never ever use something that's sharp. Silicone can be scratched, and it would be such a shame to put a scratch in your silicone mold because that'll be there forever and it'll show up in all of your pieces. So always be very gentle and delicate with your silicone molds and never use anything sharp when touching the silicone. So what I'm doing here is I have a fan brush that I am just dipping into the alcohol ink that is still pretty wet. And I'm just doing a splatter here and there. I want this to look a little antique-y, and that's not a word. But I want it to be just a tad bit distressed. I don't want the gold to be exactly right, in exactly the right spaces. I want the gold to look like there had been gold paint on it at some point and that some of that gold paint had come off. And I just think that's really fun. I like to distress things sometimes, and I really like to distress with a metallic accent. I think that's such a pretty effect. Now I'm using a color shift that is blue, purple, gold color shift, but this is a chrome. It is reflective. So you'll find when you're dusting a mold with mica powder that when you've already dusted a space and then you go back and try to dust with another color, that new color is not going to stick anywhere where there isn't exposed silicone. So I take advantage of that because that's a great thing to know. And everywhere there's blue and gold down already, the new color shift isn't going to stick. So it's only going to be reflective at just the tips of these pieces, which is exactly what I wanted it to do. It's also important to note now that I used a dryer, a heat gun, very sparingly and carefully. And then I let this sit for a while to make sure that all of the gold mica and alcohol was dry. You do not want to dust a mold with mica powder that when you have any wet alcohol ink on the mold. That said, I realized as I reached the edge that there was some wet gold in the edge. So I stopped doing any of the mica powder dusting and decided that it was a good time to finish out the gold edging since it was still wet anyway, and since I didn't want to use any more mica powder while there was still wet gold anywhere on the mold, especially the edge that I was working at. So here's that beautiful mold the next day when everything is plenty good and dry, because I definitely don't want to add resin while anything is wet because I don't want it to come up in the resin. You could use that as a technique if you wanted to, but I did not. I wanted the resin to be relatively clear on top with a little bit of gold dust because I also want a gold molten feel on top of the resin after I get everything down. But I want it to be deliberate, not accidental. So I'm mixing up my resin and I added some iridescent glitter. I'm using heavy glitter so that it will sink. I want the glitter to sink into some of the wave spaces, and I think that that's just such a pretty effect. So and all of the things that I use during this tutorial, I will try and link everything that I use down in the description so that you guys could try and recreate this or play with some of the ideas that you like from this. And I would be thrilled for you to reach out to me and let me know what you make based on my pieces. And Shop Resin Molds does a wonderful job on Instagram of showcasing art that people make with their molds. So be sure to tag Shop Resin Molds on Instagram, and if you want your pieces showcased and if you want us to see what you're working on. I will be sure and add all of the links that you need into the description. I will also be adding my information for my discount code. If you want to go buy any of these Shop Resin molds, this mold or any of the other beautiful molds that they have, you can use my code as a discount, and I get a little kickback for that, which is fantastic for really helping me bring consistently good content. So you see just that beautiful little iridescent sparkle. I made sure and used a glitter that all you could see was the sparkle, and the glitter didn't really have color, like it's not a black or a silver. It's just a really light iridescent that almost disappears in the resin, and I love that. I use this iridescent glitter all the time. And I have a little notch cut out of this. This is just a to-go container that I pour with all the time. And I cut out a notch so that it pours exactly where I want it to pour, so that the edge is really easy to keep clean and that it doesn't go all over the place, but mostly so that it directs the flow exactly where I want it. So sometimes I get a little bit overly excited about doing a pour and I forget to put on my gloves. It is incredibly important to wear your gloves and to wear your respirator when you're working with resin products. So there are some resin products that are safer than others, but I think it's a good idea with all resin, especially if you're not sure how sensitive you are. I do not have a resin sensitivity, but I don't want to develop one, and I don't want to risk it. So you'll see in a minute that I put on my gloves, but I wanted to let y'all know that that is not something that I regularly do, and that is not something that I think anyone should do. So always take a minute to double check that you have your safety precautions in place. So you'll notice as I put the resin in, I use the heat gun to blow the resin to the opposite side. I do this because I do not want to disturb the mica that is underneath or take a chance on scraping the alcohol ink with any type of tool at all. So I use the heat gun to move the resin from one side to the other to make sure that I have as little upheaval of the sediment as possible. And so I take my time and let the heat gun gracefully move the resin from one side of the mold to the other. And I'm spraying with isopropyl alcohol. I love that for reducing bubbles and also just for thinning out the resin a little bit. And in particular, when I'm working with something like this where it's going to pick up some of that gold mica, which is exactly what I wanted it to do, I didn't want it to pick up any of the color shift, but I did want it to pick up some of the gold mica, because you'll see here in a minute that I do this cool thing on the top where I kind of turn it into these molten pools and or molten strands, I guess. And I wanted that effect, and I think that's really neat. And I had a coaster that I had poured with extra resin the other day, and I thought, I'm going to go ahead and pour that too, because I had a little bit of extra resin, so it felt like it would be a fun fit. So then I realized that I did actually want some solid strands that I was not going to be able to get by transferring the gold from one to the other. So I very sparingly just added some strands, or added some dots here and there, and then blew them out to create the strands. And I love this technique. I do this all the time. This works with basically all metallic alcohol ink and all the metallic alcohol ink that I make. And this is just such a fun effect, and it's super light reflective. So when the piece is done, you have these threads on top of a molten look that's very reflective. And it adds so much depth because it's right on top. And then you have, especially with this piece, a tremendous amount of depth visually. And actually, there is a lot of depth. So I let these cure, and I made sure and covered them so that nothing would get on top, since I was going to use this as the top. I will be adding a dome coat to it as well, but I want to make sure that it doesn't get any kind of dust or anything like that. So now you can really see this is right after the pour, so it is still wet in the mold, but I wanted to show you how this looked visually to me after I got done pouring, because I was just so amazed at how gorgeous this was in the color shift. So this is the end result, and I'm absolutely ecstatic. This is one of the most gorgeous things that I've ever made. And here you can see why I chose a color shift that was translucent. I wanted to get a watery effect as the light moved through it. So I have this leaned up and I have a light going behind it so that you can see how gorgeous this translucent effect, and that is because of the shape of the mold. I thank you so much for your time. I hope that I inspired you to pull out a mold and try different techniques with it. There are so many great ways to use a silicone mold, and Shop Resin Molds provides so many good ones.